This segment is going to be talking about how we can manage the silage fermentation in order to get more sugar, more rumen residual NFC, which are two key rumen fuels that result in higher fat content and higher protein content. Relationship to keep in mind is that rumen residual NFC as a nutrient is going to be not much different based on legume to grass. As you can see, at least in this data set, we don't have a huge difference. And most of these farms here are mixed mostly grass, and they're coming in around 0.7 on average calcium. And the range here is fairly narrow, but in general, a legume is going to have more beta pectin and pectin beta glucan than grasses are. But NDF lower and balancing that with DNDF. So one thing we can do is increase the pool of NFC by harvesting thin cell walls, but we're only going to do that to the point where it doesn't make digestible fiber pool too low. So we're going to be basically dealing with an NFC of what we have, and it is made up of sugar, pectin, beta glucan, that's the lining. This is in the cell contents, that's the lining. And then we're going to reduce it by the total VFA that was produced during ensiling in order to get the rumen residual. So the more that we can limit VFA production, the higher our rumen residual is going to be. And our sugar. So VFA production limited. How are we going to accomplish that? All the ways that we talked about in terms of air, dirt, and water in the previous segment to get that fermentation to be dominated by lactic acid. One key way is going to be through dry matter. Dry matter probably has the largest impact on VFA production, not only because it produces more lactic acid, which is very important, but because that water basically will dilute the silage acids that are made, and it won't be as effective because it's diluted by the water of the plant. So the drier the plant is, the less buffered it is by the moisture there, we're going to have more effective acid going on, and the pH, terminal pH is going to be reached sooner. But there's a limit to how much drier we can go before we have problems with in other areas. Remember that lactic acid is 10 times stronger than acetic, butyric, and propionic, so we want to encourage that lactic acid as much as we can. Now, within limits, there can be too much lactic acid and not enough acetic acid, because acetic acid is a very good inhibitor of mold and yeast. So we don't want to have 10-to-1 ratio or 9-to-1 or 8-to-1 ratio of lactic to acetic. A range of ratios of lactic to acetic is going to be somewhere between 2 and 4-to-1, 3-to-1 plus or minus 1. Here's our chart that talks about NDF cell wall thickness and rumen residual. And you can see as the cell wall got thicker and thicker, our cell contents got smaller, and so our chance for having the cell wall lining to be a big part of the rumen fuel goes down as the cell wall gets thicker and thicker. So some examples of controlling dry matter and controlling the ash content from the farms that we've been looking at, 4 growing seasons in northern New York, grass only, so they're very consistent. And everyone on the farm really needs to buy into harvesting and chopping at the right dry matter and keeping the contaminants out of the silage mass, the dirt, the dust, the manure, and so forth. And there are many impact points for doing that. On dry matter, merging is the end of dry down. So once you merge those windrows, really not much more is going to happen in terms of drying down. So whoever's doing that merging has to know when to do it and not do it too soon or not do it too late. Crimping or hay crop silage is not recommended. So running a crimper in your mower is going to impede the escape of water through the ends of where the crop was cut. And we don't want to slow that down. We want to leave that crop intact so the vessels can carry moistures out of the ends of the plant where it's cut. Stubble height's going to have a huge impact on ash, but also on dry down because you've got air underneath the windrow, and that helps to dry it out faster. Every day that this crop spends in a windrow getting dry, we're losing 2 to 4% of the dry matter, and that's going to be rumen fuel that you're losing. It's going to be sugar, and it's going to be digestible fiber and rumen residual NFC. Windrow width, etc., and managing that so we get optimal dry down is very, very important. So here's a number of farms that we've got here. Looking at the dry matter window of 35 to 45%, and where does this rumen residual NFC peak at? Right here in the middle. So if we go too wet, it's going to decline. If we go too dry, it's going to decline. If we talk about ash, there's many impact points here as well, and getting everybody to buy in the importance of this is a huge thing. I've seen a number of farms that we've worked with where we've gotten people to look at the economics of their sugar being low and how ash can impact that. And once everybody's thinking along the same lines and realizing that this is important, then effectively we can lower this ash number greatly over time. I've seen it happen over and over. But field fitting, if we've got fields that are nice and level and flat and well fitted, then we can mow at a higher speed and not dig into the ground. And we could just mow slower and accomplish some of that as well. Stubble height is hugely important. There's a lot of people that are recommending now that our stubble height on grasses especially be 4 to 5 inches to get maximum regrowth. That's a little aggressive, but certainly more than 3 inches is probably the correct thing to have there. If you're trying to gain yield by decreasing that stubble height and cutting the plant shorter, you're probably going to lose in the end because you're going to increase the ash and lose the sugar. How we rake and ted and merge and all these things have an impact on it. Truck driving on windrows. If we can avoid driving on top of a windrow, we can avoid pressing that windrow into the soil and making the dirt stick to it before we pick it up with the chopper. And that's a very simple thing that can do once you're aware that it has this negative effect. The way we put on the tires and do push-ups into the silage, into the bunker silo or pile that we're making, all can have an impact on how much dirt gets mixed in there. Just dust covering tractors or trucks and so forth. And we've had people that have paved roads that are next to open silos as they're being filled to keep the dust down that's constantly coming into the open bunker as we're filling it. Here's a look at some data, and again the same group of farms, and you can see that the only time we got over 3% basically of sugar was when our ash content was 10% or lower. And the lower we made that ash content, the higher the sugar climbed. And again, on these type of graphs, I've seen this over and over and over again. So it's not just a random one that happened to work out that way. A little bit about dry matter and how that affects things, and about inoculants and acids. So this chart is set up to look at legumes, grasses basically, and corn silage. They're all going to have different windows of dry matter and moisture. So over here on the left, I talk in dry matters mostly. Other people converse in percent moisture. Here it's all the same. This is the wet side, this is the dry side. And on the wet side, the problem is we're going to get Clostridial bacteria, we're going to get high acetic acid, we're going to get maybe butyric acid. On the dry side, we tend to get mold and yeast problems. So they're all going to have a window, and the window is roughly listed here, 35 to 45% for legume, 28 to 38, maybe 30 to 40 is where I'd like to see the grasses, and 32 to 37. So 10-point windows on the haylage and a 5-point window on the corn silage. And so graphically, I'm depicting these moisture ranges or dry matter ranges. And if you're going to use an inoculant, the inoculant will only work if we have the dry matters right. The inoculant won't let you stretch much of the dry matter window. On the other hand, if we use propionic acid, specifically a propionic acid-based acid product, it's going to allow us to go wetter and drier, both, because the propionic acid will inhibit mold and yeast on the dry side, and it will inhibit the bad types of fermentations that happen on the wet side. So that's what we're looking at there. And just to demonstrate what I just said, a graph that shows that here's our good bacteria growing, lactic acid bacteria growing. Here's our bad bacteria, Clostridia, Bacillus, yeast, and mold, so bacteria and fungi. And if we look at these different acids, propionic acid is going to inhibit, versus acetic acid or formic acid, inhibit the molds and the yeast and the Bacillus and the Clostridia, but allow lactic acid bacteria to grow. So that's why it's such an effective treatment in order to try to maximize rumen fuel. And generally, the addition of rumen fuel that you get as a result is going to way more than pay for what it costs. And with that, we'll end this section, and hopefully you'll be watching other segments.